The United Kingdom plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. What's behind the move? And what happens next? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The UK Parliament has passed a controversial bill that will allow the government to send asylum seekers to the African nation Rwanda. Both countries earlier agreed to a financial incentive. Thousands of migrants could now be forced to leave the United Kingdom, some as early as July. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says the scheme will deter others from entering the UK and seeking asylum.
The first flight will leave in 10 to 12 weeks. And the success of this deterrent doesn't rest on one flight alone. It rests on the relentless, continual process of successfully and permanently removing people to Rwanda with a regular rhythm of multiple flights every month over the summer and beyond until the boats are stopped.
But the move is highly controversial. Critics have called it inhumane and illegal. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees says it sets a dangerous precedent for other countries which are already accepting refugees.
This makes my work, our work, very difficult. There are countries taking in millions of refugees. I'm not talking about the Ukrainians. I'm talking about countries in Africa. You know, I spoke to the president of Costa Rica the other day, 150,000 Nicaraguans. I was in Cameroon not long ago. They host hundreds of thousands of people from the Central African Republic, and more may come. And what am I going to tell them if they say, you know, a rich country like the UK is sending them abroad? I'll do the same. I'll close my border. I say, you know, I want to save them from a dangerous journey and they can go to another country. The precedent that this creates is catastrophic for a concept that needs to be shared like asylum.
To discuss all of this, joining us from London is Jonathan Liss. He is a political commentator and journalist. Also joining the discussion here in Washington, D.C. is Abdullahi Boruhalake. He is an Africa security and policy analyst. And from Paris with us too is journalist and author Nabila Ramdani. Welcome to all of you to the show. Jonathan, let me start with you. This Rwanda bill, it's a very controversial bill. It's really divided Britain. It was passed after months of deadlock. Why has it been so divisive?
Because it not only would appear to break international law and absent the UK from the global asylum and refugee conventions of the last of the post-war consensus, but it also goes against the UK's own Supreme Court, which ruled that the scheme would be unlawful because Rwanda was not a safe country. And the UK government, in response, decided to make a law that effectively said black was white. So they decided to pass a law that said Rwanda is safe. It's called the Safety of Rwanda Bill. And that actually has implications not only for international law, but for the separation of powers in the UK, because it would seek to circumvent the judiciary, because the judiciary has made a conclusion, and the UK government and now the Parliament has sidestepped that. And what we now have is a deeply inhuman and inhumane set of consequences whereby the UK is going to be deporting people who might be legitimate refugees to Rwanda, a country that they have absolutely no claim to and no sort of association with. They might have relatives here. They might even be victims of modern slavery, and the UK government is going to discount all of that and deport them.
Jonathan, the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he says this is about saving lives. It's about putting an end to the smuggling of people. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The truth is, we need innovative solutions to address what is a global migration crisis, to disrupt the business model of people smuggling gangs and save lives. And that means a systematic deterrent.
So, Jonathan, what do you make of him saying that, look, this is to stop the smuggling of people? I mean, how devastating would it be for people trying to get into the UK?
Well, it's not going to be a deterrent. People are risking their lives to come to the UK on these small boats. The prospect of being deported to Rwanda is not going to deter them because people are desperate enough to make the journey in the first place. The UK government has been saying all along that it's motivated by a desire to stop the boats. That is a complete nonsense. It's in fact a lie. If the UK wanted to stop the small boats, it could allow safe and legal routes for asylum seekers to come across the channel. It's not doing that because it's not interested in solutions. It's interested in appearing tough. For example, it could allow processing centres in France. So asylum seekers could be processed before, and then if their claims are granted, then they could come across.
Yeah.
It could allow them to board vessels in France, for example, to come to the UK safely and legally, after which time they could make a claim for asylum in the UK. But it's not doing that. It's only allowing certain very narrow claims from people, from, say, Ukraine, so thereby they can circumvent the boats. If you come from, say, Sudan, which, as we know, is facing a massive humanitarian crisis at the moment, there is no safe or legal route for you to claim asylum in the United Kingdom, and that is a scandal.
And Jonathan, do you have any idea of how many people will be impacted by this?
We think that there might only be a few hundred people, maximum 1,000 people, who even go to Rwanda. So all along, this has been a symbol of something. By the government's own admission, the people who are coming across the boats is vastly greater than the number that could ever be deported to Rwanda under this scheme. So the government is really hoping that it's going to be a deterrent. But as we've already established, this is not going to be a deterrent at all. People already in the UK are not being processed. So really, we are just sort of deferring the problem for a later time and not offering any concrete solutions.
Abdullahi, Rwanda is a country in Central East Africa. I mean, how did Rwanda get involved in this expulsion plan in the first place?
Rwanda, especially under the current president, Paul Kagame, has become a very entrepreneurial state, meaning they know how to exploit the anxieties of political system in the West. So it has made itself available to try and resolve some of these problems. But I don't think this is a solution like Jonathan has stated, for obvious reasons that it is not just practically impossible to do this by the notion that once you sound very tough and it's all theater, people will stop coming to your country. The reason why people are opting for those very difficult journey is because the system is not working. So the Prime Minister is trying to solve a problem that they've created themselves, but by now outsourcing to a country like Rwanda. Let me give you an example. If I am from the DRC, there is a tension currently between DRC and Rwanda, and I've sought asylum for one reason or the other in the UK. Would I be taken to Rwanda? What would happen? What would happen to me? So, and these are some of the arguments that the court has made. The court has made it very clear or established that Rwanda is not a safe and secure country. Rwanda's legal system or asylum claim is not very clear because the number of rejection has significantly increased. And fundamentally, the post-World War II order around the normative international standard around refugees and asylum was really to prevent refoulement, which means forced return to their country of origin, and that will lead to other challenges.
Yeah, and that example that you cited there, Abdullahi, a British minister was asked about that, and in fact it turned out that he wasn't really clear that Congo and Rwanda are two different countries. Nabila, great to see you. Many of those seeking refuge in Britain cross the English Channel and come from France. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, has criticized that British plan. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
I also do not believe in the model that is being proposed to us today, which consists of finding third countries on the African continent or elsewhere, where the idea would be to take back people who have come to our shores illegally and who do not come from the same countries. We are creating a geopolitics of cynicism that betrays our values and will create new dependencies that will prove totally ineffective.
So, Nabila, very tough language there from the French president, but isn't Macron actually part of the problem? Shouldn't France be doing more to ensure the safety of refugees?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what Macron's words actually illustrate is the game of political ping pong, effectively, that is being played with human lives as the West effectively struggles to deal with one of the biggest global problems of our age, that is a massive increase in migration. And this rhetoric between Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Emmanuel Macron illustrates that, not least of all on the issue of the return of asylum seekers, which is an extremely confusing concept because it came to prominence this month when the UK Prime Minister said his country would not accept the return of asylum seekers from Ireland. And there is, in fact, a lot of evidence that these immigrants are entering the Irish Republic from Northern Ireland and then trying to get back to Northern Ireland, which is, of course, part of the UK. But what Mr. Sunak said is that he would refuse to accept such return asylum seekers because France does not accept returns. And that is to say that if asylum seekers leave the EU and enter Britain, France will not accept them back. And so the Irish government says that the threat of deportation to Rwanda has partly fueled a surge in arrivals entering Ireland via the land border with Northern Ireland, a route that is now accounts for more than 80% of asylum seekers in the Republic. And so the Irish cabinet is considering emergency legislation to facilitate returning asylum seekers to the UK, and they deem it a legal fix that is required to reverse an Irish High Court ruling last month that the UK was no longer a safe third country because it wants to send asylum seekers to Rwanda.
Nabila, as Jonathan told us a moment ago, the United Kingdom's highest court has ruled that this plan is illegal, but then the government, went around that plan by introducing legislation. Now, Britain, of course, is not a member of the EU because of Brexit, but it is still part of Europe's human rights architecture or human rights system. Could this end up in the European Court of Human Rights?
Yes, I think so. And I think what it illustrates is that Europe in general, as a continent, is now at a crossroads. It can either move ahead with the policies of deterrence and exclusion, which will simply drive more people onto dangerous journeys, or choose to lead by example, advancing safe pathways and indeed safeguarding the rights of refugees and asylum seekers in a spirit of global humanitarian leadership. But there's no sense of any of that amongst EU, European leaders in general, and quite the opposite. There is a hardening sentiment towards migrants in general, and it's one of the issues that has given rise to, the hardening of politics as well, moving more and more to the right, not to say the far right.
Abdullahi, this plan that was hatched by the British, could it set a precedent where other European countries decide, well, if Britain can do it, we can do it. Let's outsource our refugee issues, our asylum issues to somebody else?
Thank you so much. That's a very important question because this is nothing new. It's in fact a just continuation of another policy. Because I think what we have to be very careful with is that in Europe, or at least in the West, there is the argument that there is a refugee crisis. There isn't a refugee crisis. If there is a refugee crisis, it is in some of those countries. If you look at the statistics of countries like Kenya, they host over 600,000 refugees, over half of them Somalis. You look at Ethiopia, they host over 2.5 million, over 900,000, almost 1 million refugees. If you look at Uganda, it's host over 1.2 million refugees. So the notion that in the West that there is a refugee crisis is a manufactured crisis because of what Nabila pointed out too. Because even the parties that are traditionally on the left that espouses multiculturalism, we are happy to receive refugees, now are very much afraid that they're going to the left, in fact, trying to outright the right wing so that they can make this a problem. So this is I'll just give an example. currently in Sudan, the crisis that we have between the military and RSF, that is Rapid Support Forces. Rapid Support Forces in the past, before it rebranded itself, it was called the Janjaweed. And the EU was giving money to Janjaweed to prevent people moving from the Horn of Africa via Sudan into Libya and into Mediterranean. And now we have a crisis with RSF that has received a lot of money and training that is doing the same. Look at Tunisia. So I think this is something that the West is completely walking away from the international normative standards around refugees and asylum. And I'll just give an example. I just returned from Kenya the other day. Kenya just has a new refugee law with over 500,000 refugees, where now they'll get right to work, right to own property, and freedom of movement. In the West, they are moving in the opposite direction. Other countries are taking a fairly robust pro-refugee policy, except Rwanda in this case.
Right. Nabila, on the question of the domestic political impact of refugees in Europe, I mean, is that what is fueling this sharp support that we see for far-right parties?
Yes, undoubtedly. I think the far-right across Europe is capitalizing on rising nationalist sentiment gripping countries across Western Europe, and this has to do with a perceived migration crisis, because, as Abdullah quite rightly said, in fact, a major refugee hosting countries include countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and the Sahel, for example, and they are particularly affected by the increasing food insecurity and all the problems that come with it. For example, 76% of the world's refugees are hosted by low or middle income countries, and many of which are unable to get adequate support for their needs. So, but this perceived migration crisis is undoubtedly what fuels the rise of the rise of the far right, and support for far right countries is growing in Europe because of that. There are populist, anti-immigrant parties across the continent that have wrapped up a series of once unthinkable victories, and most recently in the Netherlands.
Yeah. Jonathan, you know, people in the United Kingdom have very strong opinions in this, on both sides of this debate. Let's listen to two people who were interviewed on the streets of London. Let's watch this.
I'm embarrassed to live in a country that will pass a law like that. I think it's appalling. The refugees that are coming over have a right. They're not illegal. They're taking great risks, and we should be accommodating them.
It's a sad situation, but we can't continue to allow foreigners to just invade the country as they're doing, despite whatever circumstance they're in.
So, Jonathan, is what we are seeing now actually a byproduct of Brexit? Because if we go back to that time, it was immigration that was one of the key issues, wasn't it?
Yes, I think that there is a difference between legal immigration and irregular immigration. And what the government has been very cunning to do in the last couple of years is to distract people's attention from legal migration to the UK, which is actually at an all-time high, despite Brexit, to focus on the small boats arrivals, which take up a small proportion of the total number of people coming to the UK. So in that sense, I suppose that the government wants to cover its tracks on Brexit, which, as you pointed out, was advertised as a great way to stop migration, and has not proven to be that, because the truth of it always was that the UK desperately needs and depends on migration to prop up its infrastructure and its public services. So we'll always need migrants. And actually, if you take these asylum seekers, many of them, if accepted, would go on to be incredibly productive members of British society, as has been the case for decades with refugees who go on to live very fulfilling, meaningful lives in the UK. But obviously the government doesn't want that, and it wants to focus on them and create a kind of an atmosphere and climate of fear around these arrivals and stoke people's fears and cater to people's worst instincts.
And Jonathan, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he says this is already a success, and he points to the number of people who are now going to the Republic of Ireland rather than coming to the United Kingdom. I mean, do you believe this could stop people coming from the United Kingdom? And it's also causing problems with the Irish government.
Well, I saw a thread on Twitter by one of the BBC economics correspondents who suggested that actually arrivals in Ireland were consistent with previous periods, and there was no direct causality between the new law and those arrivals. But obviously, it's the case that if the UK is coming across as a deeply hostile country, some of the people who are currently in the UK might seek to make their way to Ireland. And the point is that, I've been making for a long time, and many others, is that countries can't simply outsource the problem to the country to their right. So Ireland should be taking a kind of a fair proportion of the asylum seekers in Europe. It shouldn't be the responsibility of those countries like Italy and Greece that find themselves on the very edge of Europe and that where a lot of the people are first arriving. So the problem should be shared across Europe as a continent, and the UK fundamentally should be doing its bit and not asking other countries with comparable sizes and economies to be doing the job for it.
Abdullah, we heard from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees at the beginning of the program, but he also said that the protection of refugees requires all countries to be part of the solution. And what the United Kingdom is doing right now is actually undermining international cooperation and setting, as we said, this precedent, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we're not talking about, Bulgaria or other countries. We are talking about the UK, and it's a P5 member. Just again, coming back to the Sudan's situation that I highlighted, the UK is the penholder at the UN Security Council on Sudan. And simultaneously, it champions the cause of refugees, for instance, from Ukraine, and they deserve all the support that they're getting. What would they say to refugee or someone who was very desperate running away from Sudan? Are you telling those people that they are not willing to use every means available, like every other human being, to be able to leave the country, that their lives will be in a very difficult situation? Rishi Sunak and his families were from the East Africa during Idi Amin period. What if at that time they were told that him and probably, the former Minister for Interior, that they are not going to get asylum. Asylum is not something that is given. Asylum is an inalienable human right. But once you start limiting asylum, once you start limiting refugee, people who are seeking refuge, what signal are you sending? We have right now in Sudan, I'm just using Sudan as an example because the latest example, probably one of the largest displacement, over 7 million people upwards. Are you telling me now that Central African Republic, Chad, that is already hosting over 400,000 refugees, they are not going to host refugees? Are you saying to Uganda, are you saying to Kenya, are you saying to any of these countries that, look, you do not have to regard this as anything? So I think, to my mind, this is a very dangerous precedent. We are, if we're not very careful, completely destroying the Refugee Convention, which came into effect after the devastation of Second World War in Europe, and one of its central pillars is preventing forced return to the countries where people still face imminent danger. So I think, to my mind, it's just a long way of saying that the UK is playing with fire and is setting a very dangerous precedent.
Nabila, of course, this issue has been a major issue in European countries for some time. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are seeking refuge, who are seeking asylum in European countries. I mean, do you see European countries get together to try and find a solution, or are we in an age right now when, given the very highly divisive political climate that we are in right now, and what a hot-button issue this is, that we shouldn't expect too much?
Well, EU member states have tried to come together and try to formulate a solution, or dare I say, a new approach to what they view as an immigration problem. And they have been advancing stricter migration rules. And this materialized in the European Commission's pact on migration and asylum that has been formulated. I mean, its inception was in September 2020, but 3 years further down the line, the negotiations became more conclusive in 2023, and there's still not a great deal of specifics as of today. But the idea is that it's a complex package, admittedly, by the EU itself, a package of reforms intended to mark a fresh start for EU asylum and indeed migration policies. And the idea is the old system no longer works, and a move towards a more practical one is needed. And this new pact is meant to be one of the biggest overhauls to the EU asylum and migration policies in years. And it's meant to address lots of policy areas, including the different proposals and recommendations in the areas of migration, asylum, integration, and indeed border management. But already critics are saying that it has in fact resulted in increased political polarization, with states diverging from EU and indeed international law, and more human rights violations at the borders, at Europe's borders, and of course immense suffering experienced by people on the move.
Jonathan, the main opposition party in Britain, the Labour Party, they say they're expected to win the next general election, looking at polling figures right now, but they say that when they come to power, they will scrap the Rwanda bill. I mean, how big an election issue would this be, and would Labour live up to that election promise?
I think that the Conservatives will be desperate to talk about Rwanda during the election campaign because they're trying to stave off a flight of Conservative voters to the more right-wing Reform Party, and that is driving a lot of the dire polling figures for the Conservatives at the moment. The problem is the Conservatives are losing voters on both flanks. They're losing more liberal-minded voters who are disgusted by this performative cruelty that we're seeing from the Conservative Party, not just on the Rwanda issue, but on many sort of social issues as well.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.